Welcome back. In the previous segment, I gave you a bunch of commentaries that I think could be extremely valuable to you, as well as just sort of an ideology on how to approach the use of commentaries. In this segment, I want to give you a bunch of resources that I think would be really, really helpful to you, and specifically preaching books. Now, there are lots and lots of preaching books written every year, literally dozens and dozens of preaching books that are out there. If you're going to be a really effective impact preacher, my encouragement to you is to read at least one preaching book every year. Now, if you're a newer preacher, I'd encourage you to read more than that, but I'd encourage you to read at least one. For the rest of your life, if you're going to be an effective preacher, an effective pastor, read at least one quality preaching book every year. We should never get to the point where we feel like we've learned everything we need to learn and we can never grow and get better. We should always get better and better and better. So with that admonishment and that encouragement in mind, I want to give you a few of my favorite preaching books. I have read dozens of preaching books. I don't know exactly how many, but it wouldn't shock me if I've read at least 30 or 40 at this point in my life. And I'll give you my favorites. The first book I would recommend is called Preachers and Preaching, and it's by Martin Lloyd-Jones. I've already mentioned him in this enrichment course. In the earlier segments, I quoted from this book. This is a fantastic book. It's a classic, known by many people to be the most effective and most influential book on preaching written in the modern era. I would highly encourage you to check it out. Again, really, really helpful. Another great book on preaching I'd highly encourage you to pick up is by Tim Keller, and it's called Preaching, really original, right? Preaching by Tim Keller is fantastic. Some of the content that I have mentioned and outlined in this enrichment course does come from that book, Tim Keller, specifically the idea of preaching culturally, where he talks about the importance of addressing cultural trends and speaking to the heart. He gives a lot of ideas on how to do that really effectively. Tim Keller is one of the best teachers, in my opinion, of the modern era, and his book is fantastic, Preaching by Tim Keller. Another great book I alluded to earlier in this course is called Christ-Centered Preaching, and that's by Bryan Chapell. Again, in this book, he talks a lot about how to be Christ-centered. He gives a lot of mechanics on how to be an effective speaker, but he also talks extensively about the fallen, conditioned focus that I talked about earlier in the enrichment course. I would encourage you to check that book out, Christ-Centered Preaching by Bryan Chapell. Another great book on preaching is a relatively new book, just come out in 2017. It's called Preaching for the Rest of Us. It's by Robert Gallaty and Stephen Smith. And really the idea of this book is to teach a lot of the concepts that I've teaching in this course, but to do it in a really simple fashion. It's really, really quick, simple. You're not going to get a lot of deep, ideas. It's not going to give you a lot of mechanics on how to unpack certain philosophies. It kind of gives you a quick, broad understanding of preaching in a really simple way. If you are a new preacher, if you've not been to seminary or taken any formal preaching classes, this is a great, great book. In fact, this is a book I would recommend to newer preachers. When someone's new, I would hand them this book and I would get them started on preaching by using this particular text. Again, it's called Preaching for the Rest of Us by Robert Gallaty and Stephen Smith. Another great book on preaching that I'd highly recommend comes from one of my favorite preachers from all of church history. It's by Charles Spurgeon. It's called Lectures to My Students. Charles Spurgeon was the great British Baptist pastor in the 1800s, known as the Prince of Preachers. This man was one of the most dynamic, one of the most effective, one of the greatest preachers from all of church history. He was theologically robust and yet very simple. He was bold but pastoral. And in Lectures to My Students, Spurgeon gives us many of the things that he teaches the men that he mentored in his church. All of the guys that were being trained to be pastors and preachers in his church context that he eventually sent out to be preachers and missionaries all throughout England. These are the things that he taught them that he thought was really important for preachers to know. I think, in my opinion, this is a must-read book for every pastor, for every preacher. Lectures to My Students by Charles Spurgeon. Another recent book I encourage you to check out is called Expository Preaching by David Helm. It's really, really simple. He talks about some of the basic elements of expository preaching, some of the philosophy and thought process we ought to have when we approach a particular text in the scriptures. Again, it's called Expository Preaching by David Helm. It's really short, really easy. You could read it in an hour and a half. Really, really helpful book. Another book I'd highly encourage you to check out is by the famous theologian and preacher John Stott, one of the most influential evangelical writers and preachers of the 20th century. He wrote a book called Between Two Worlds. This, again, is a classic book, largely regarded as one of the most influential books on preaching ever written. He really popularized the idea that the preacher is the messenger or the ambassador for God to the people. This idea that these two worlds, there's a world where God is ruling, and then there's kind of the world where people are living their own way. In the world in their heart and their mind where they're not really living for God. And we as the preacher, we are the ambassador for God from His world, into their hearts and their minds. And we are called to bring truth in a powerful and bold manner where we challenge people to allow the Scriptures to really govern and inform how they think and live their lives. This idea that we are the ambassador, the modern day prophet, so to speak. And it is a fantastic book that I believe every preacher and every pastor should read. Again, Between Two Worlds by John Stott. The next book I would recommend is called How to Speak to Teens and Keep Them Awake at the Same Time. Now, this book is not necessarily a preaching book per se. It's more of a speaking book. And it is really geared toward how to speak to younger demographics. If you're going to preach to youth, young adults, children, this book gives you a lot of practical tools and techniques that can be really helpful. It's written by a guy named Ken Davis, who is a very good communicator, in my opinion. And it's a really, really practical book. So I encourage you to check it out. Now, in this book, he doesn't talk about expository preaching. In fact, he actually makes popular a particular method called the SCORE method. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's a really, really popular method that a lot of people use to develop topical sermons. Now, as I've talked about in this enrichment course, I'm not a big fan of topical sermons in most cases, but if you are going to preach topical sermons, and if you're committed to using that style, I would encourage you to pick up this book because Ken Davis really teaches the method, the SCORE method, and how to develop a really effective topical sermon that'll be really memorable. And he gives a lot of practical tools and techniques on how to basically keep people engaged, how to keep people awake, how to keep them lively and excited about the content you are giving them. So again, that's called How to Speak to Teens and Keep Them Awake at the Same Time by Ken Davis. Another book that I absolutely love recommending to preachers is a book called The Supremacy of God in Preaching by John Piper. And in this book, he talks extensively about how we can be more focused on highlighting the attributes of God in all of our sermons. John Piper makes a point that in every single sermon text, we need to be pulling out the attributes of God, putting them on display, and really causing our people to be in awe of God, to make God supreme in their lives. So I would highly encourage you to check that out. Again, it's called The Supremacy of God in Preaching by John Piper. The final book I would encourage you to check out is called Biblical Preaching by Haddon Robinson. This book is a really, really common textbook used in seminaries. It gives lots of understandings as to how we should approach passages of Scripture. It gives you a lot of mechanics on how to structure sermon outlines and sermon manuscripts. It's kind of not the most theological book, but also not the most practical book. It's really a good marriage between being theologically savvy and theologically minded when you are approaching your sermon outlines, as well as how to just be practical. What are some of the pragmatic things you should be doing when you are crafting a sermon outline or a sermon manuscript? It's a fantastic book, really good resource. I encourage you to check out. Again, that's Biblical Preaching by Haddon Robinson. So I started this segment by telling you that I think that every great preacher should read at least one preaching book every single year. Well, I pretty much just took care of the next 8 or 9 years for you. I encourage you to go through this list, read one of them a year, and I believe they'll be helpful to you as you seek to be a great preacher. In the next segment, I'm going to give you a few resources on how to be effective in your hermeneutic approach.